that was the only way I could think of, like, getting everybody to quiet down. So we're
by making more noise first.
To make more noise. I guess maybe we're applauding each other. I'm applauding you guys for coming and making this a really, really great conference. This is really just, I think, turned out fantastic. We weren't really sure if this would work. We just, a couple grad students and a few more grad students helping us made the conference that we would want to go to. And I wanted to be at this conference, so that was really fun. I think it was a success. The Twitter back channel has been really exciting and active for those. This is an augmented conference. There's the physical conference and there's the digital conference. And our experience was that it was, of course, both. So that's been really great. And we've been putting photos online live. You can go to the Picasso page, the Flickr page. We'll post all this stuff.
We've been tweeting the links, so if you want to search for them. And
so
it'll all be posted on the blog.
Yeah, I think that's one of the main points that we want to get across. We've had some cards. We spread them around the Cyborgology blog. Obviously, the conference is under the Cyborgology project. So as we disseminate some of the literature from the conference, so the slides, the keynote slides, plenaries, and all the information that we can possibly get, we're going to put all that stuff on the blog. Video, audio, the Twitter archive, we're going to archive that, and so the back channel is archived, and we can do some meta-analysis, some meta-discussion on the blog. Speaking of meta-discussion on the blog, if you would like to review or write a blog post about the conference and what you thought were the main themes, what were the shortcomings? I mean, critique this conference. How could it be better if we do this again next year? We'd like to do this again next year. Yes. We definitely know the internet. And, so apologies. I mean, old IT was on it, so apologies that the internet wasn't quite as available, but I guess we had to use our laptops to take notes instead of, I don't know, maybe we were more focused. I'm not going to do it. So apologies for that. So stay on top of the blog. We're going to post a lot of the material from this conference on the blog, and let us know if you feel like there was something that came from the conference that you want to blog about. Let us know. We can have that. I think one of the main themes that I got from the conference is exactly what we thought going in, was this augmented reality, the digital and the physical, and I was really, really excited every panel I went to, people were hitting on that. And not just privileging the physical, not just privileging the digital, really combining those in very interesting ways. I wish I could have seen all the talks, but that was, to me, one of the major themes that I saw from the conference. So that was really exciting for me. So
okay, so I'll take a moment to introduce Danah. I know it's almost absurd to do that with this crowd. I guarantee everybody in the room already knows Danah and her work. But, I will do the perfunctory recitation of credentials because this is an academic conference, after all. So Danah is a senior researcher at Microsoft Research, and she's a research associate at Harvard's Berkman Center. She's written extensively on youth and social media, as well as on other web-related topics, including visibility, privacy, racial segregation, sexting, and the list goes on and on. But importantly to us, Danah was really the first person we thought of having as a keynote. When we were in the very early stages of envisioning this conference, we really, we thought that Danah would be the perfect fit, and she graciously agreed to serve as our keynote. And we're really excited to have her. And in many ways, she actually embodies, I think, important aspects of this conference. She's very much a public intellectual. She blogs. She speaks often at an extraordinary range of venues. She's, for those reasons, I think, she's really a role model to a new generation of grad students that I think values that sort of engagement. At least I'd like to think so. I think that especially the group in this room that has really found the message of this conference appealing, myself included. I think also Danah I found has a remarkable ability to understand young people. I'm very impressed by that. I mean, she gets it, right? I've taught some of her work to my intro students before, And the reaction, sort of, it's funny, but the reaction's kind of like, yeah, so what? We know all this already. Well, why are you assigning this? Which, of course, is the perfect reaction, right? I mean, she's got it just right. And so actually, the way I remedy it, there's this little clip of Dana on the O'Reilly show, where on the O'Reilly Factor, where Bill O'Reilly is like, kids these days in their newfangled my place, and sort of Dana's interaction with Bill O'Reilly, and that makes the students get it. They say, oh, that's why this is important. Sort of understanding how important it is to communicate across these generational lines, and I think that Dana has perhaps done that more effectively than any other internet research scholar, and I think it's both with the warmest welcome and a humblest appreciation that I now turn the stage over to her. So thank you very much.
That was a little embarrassing. So thank you for sticking around tonight. Can everybody hear me in the back? All right, great, because I don't really like microphones so well. So I want to talk about some of my new work, and I've done something sort of cruel to myself, which is I'm giving you a keynote of material that I've never presented before, and I'm still in the middle of coding, in the hopes that I sort of can get you to sort of think with me. And the point is that many of you have notebooks out. Be critical. I'd love critical feedback on this, because this is all very much a work in progress. So it's sort of odd to be at a conference that's really about theorizing the web, because I feel in some ways that I try to do the exact opposite. I go for sort of basic explanations to people like Bill O'Reilly, where you just sort of nod along and are like, yes, let me give you a sort of simpler frame to work with. But at the same time, I think PJ is totally right. My role is basically like duh. So usually when I talk to young people, they sit there and go, duh, right? Why is this so interesting? And I was like, that's sort of what I have fun with. So I'm hoping to do some of that with my new work on privacy, which is what I want to talk with you about today. So I've spent the last 6 years running around the United States talking to young people about their use of social media, what they're doing, how they're engaging with all these technologies. And most of the time I drive my questions by the fears and anxieties that the public has. And so I love reading the fear-mongering. I find it really fun. And so for the last about 18 months ago, 2 years ago, there was an ongoing onslaught of kids don't care about privacy. Privacy is dead. And I was like, oh, we're back to that again. Then I decided it was time to actually go and talk to young people about privacy specifically. And I've been talking to teenagers for a while actually about privacy, but I really dove in and talked to teens more recently. And so I'm actually doing a methodological slide. For anybody who's ever seen me do a popular talk, you realize that this is heretical. But I'm going to give you some sense of what I do methodologically. I'm mostly drawing from ethnographic data collected both online and offline for the last 6 years. The red dots are places where I went and did sort of observation-based field work. The blue dots include, in addition to observations within those communities, include semi-structured interviews. And the data set that I'm drawing on is 163 semi-structured interviews, each lasting about 90 minutes. 21 of these were conducted with my collaborator, Alice Marwick, who is phenomenal. And we very much strategically worked to sample across gender, race, ethnicity, religion, age, socioeconomic status, political backgrounds, school attitude, in all of these different regions, working with all sorts of local folks to do that. And it's sort of interesting that all of the teens that I interviewed basically were high school age, and that meant that they may have dropped out of high school, but they were of high school age when we talked to them. The quotes that I'm going to be pulling from today are primarily from the newest set of data, which are primarily in Boston, the Atlanta suburbs, Nashville, the suburbs of North Carolina, and DC. One thing to note is that whenever I give talks, the names are all fictional. The locations have been slightly blurred, and none of these photos are real, okay? So one of the things I've is like, why are you revealing these kids' pictures? I'm not. So just sort of keep that in the back of your mind as we work it. The goal is to give you a sense of their voices and to give you a sense of what they're thinking. All right, social media. So participation is sort of a really interesting baseline. Teenagers spend a lot of time participating in different forms of social media, and it's extremely popular. So basic question is why? Why is it so powerful? For a typical American teen, social media has become a sort of social necessity. Early on in my fieldwork, back when MySpace was extremely the dominant site, Skylar told her mother a quote that lived with me to this day. If you're not on MySpace, you don't exist. And what she was talking about was what it meant to be a participant in her high school, in her community. And it was about the idea that she was crafting of what existence meant in the public or the community that mattered to her. Likewise, we'll hear this over and over again from all sorts of teens in all sorts of different ways. This sort of social pressure, the peer pressure to join a form of social media, regardless of what the popular social media is, in order to be a part of that community. And this kind of expectations plays out really strongly, and there's a sort of constant sort of hum of this. And I thought Abigail's put it beautifully. You know, you're expected to be on Facebook. Well, how would people respond if you weren't? People would ask you why. You'd have to have a good reason. You know, it's not like you have to pay for it. It's pretty much expected that you're on Facebook. Right? And what Abigail's pointing out is multiple layers. One is this idea that expectation is it's a free site. And of course, there's many in the room here who have critiqued the notion of free in these spaces. It is a free site, and it's something that because of that, you are expected to be there. And there's something interesting that you'll hear with young people where they'll talk about other spaces that they are to be going to or not to go to, and the ways in which economic barriers play a part of it, and the ways that this is believed to be an open access issue. Now, of course, how young people get access is extremely variable. Participation levels are extremely variable. And frankly, if teenagers find that their friends are not on these sites, they're not on these sites. So you have some really interesting cluster effects that play out across the United States in different ways. But these sites are still extremely dominant in terms of the cultural resonance and what people believe. Most of it at this point is extremely Facebook-driven. Now, that does not mean that it's only Facebook-driven. And I was, actually, to be honest with you, I was stunned that all fall I kept hearing MySpace over and again. I'm like, really? Still? And it's funny for me to be asking that. But I was like, okay. MySpace is still really prevalent. Twitter is really prevalent in certain groups. Other groups, you get DeviantArt. So you get some variation. But Facebook has become the gold standard, and people will talk about their participation on other sites in relation to Facebook, which is really interesting. So why Facebook? And in some ways, the explanations come to any of the sites, but it's about social density, right? Everyone is on it. You go to the place because it's the social norm, it's the social expectation, it's the social home, right? Everyone is on it, and you get to have these friendships that you get to maintain over time, which is also really interesting to think about young people and their notions of time and how they think about longitudinal relationships. And finally, there's a process by which you can get notified and you can be kept in the loop. And what that means is a cyclical feedback loop for why participation in these systems becomes really important. And another way of thinking about it is that it becomes your scrapbook of your social life. Right? It becomes a way of tracking your history, a way of tracking your relationships, a moment of data feedback. And this is really interesting, given, especially as researchers where we're really interested in data and data analytics. These moments in which you have data about yourself, and the self is produced in this way that it becomes external, that you can do as a feedback loop. All of this plays into why young people are participating in these sites. And yet, one of the arguments that I make is that the most important thing that plays out in a site like Facebook or in other forms of social media is that we can conceptualize them as networked publics. And in this way, I'm using publics in the sort of notion of Warner and what it means to sort of build out these spaces and these relationships, these connections that become our communities. So network publics we can think of as publics that are restructured by network technologies. As such, they are simultaneously the space constructed through network technology and the imagined community that emerges as a result of the intersection of people, technology, and practice. Right? And these spaces and connections and relationships all come together to have these sense of publics that young people very much use in the way that young people have always used publics that they've had access to. It's a place to socialize, it's groups in which to gossip with, it's a way to joke around, to flirt, to hang out, right? Another one of those phrases that manages to make adults, historically always angry. Kids, they waste their time. What are they doing hanging out, right? The same thing happens with regard to social media. And part of that has to do with this ways in which we think about publics. Now, I think it's really interesting to highlight that adults think that teenagers don't care about privacy. And there's some really interesting assumptions in this. One is their assumption that public life or participation in public life equals a disinterest in privacy. Right? That is not true for adults, and that is certainly not true for teenagers. Right? Public life is not in opposition to privacy. And sharing publicly isn't necessarily about being public. Okay? And I think it's really important to sort of tease that out. That the idea of sharing to be public is different than the idea of sharing to be in a public. Okay? So think about that, right? Which is the idea that when we share to be public, we have this notion that everything is about publicizing, the idea of spreading to an entire world, give attention to everybody, extreme, 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 versus the idea of wanting to walk out and to participate within a social world and to be a part of a public. And what you see is that the vast majority of young people come to these spaces to participate in a public rather than to be public. Okay? Now, of course, there's inflections, and we'll get into some of those in a moment. One of the reasons why this becomes a really sort of interesting challenge to adults' rhetoric around kids and privacy is that adults have spent a long time doing everything possible to keep teenagers out of public, right? They're not wanting to be in those public spaces, right? Jill Valentine has done an amazing job of documenting sort of the removal of young people from public spaces. But we see the same sort of rhetoric playing out all over the United States and how young people think about their relationship more broadly. And it certainly plays out with what goes on online, right? It's basically you're not to be a part of a public in any form. And yet young people sort of come back and sort of push up against that. So if we think of that point as resistance, it becomes a really powerful way of seeing what young people are doing. All right, so now let's talk for a moment about the architecture. One of the things that's powerful about social media is the way in which it creates a certain kind of public space, a certain kind of networked connection, certain kinds of community. And I've talked about this previously, so those who are familiar with my work sort of know this in terms of affordances, the ideas of how network publics have very different kinds of affordances than other publics. This is where I go on and on about persistence and searchability, replicability and scalability. I'm going to sort of not bore you with all of the details of that, but to think about it, what it means for publics in this context, and that the idea that the architecture and its affordances and the way that it gets embraced very much inflects different practices and different practices in these kinds of publics. So let me talk to you about Alicia. She talks about how, I just think that technology is redefining what's acceptable for people to put out about themselves. I've grown up with technology, so I don't know how it was before this boom of social networking. But it just seems like instead of spending all of our time talking to other individual people and sharing things that would seem private, we spend all of our time putting it into one module of communication where people can just go and access if they want to. So it's just more convenient. I think that adults think that think about privacy because they see pictures being put up and they never had that ability. Right? So what she's pointing out is this sort of shift from the motion of sharing to the motion of making available. Now she continues on in a way that I think is really fascinating. She says, so when they see our photo albums or when they see conversations on Facebook wall to wall, they think it's a huge breach of privacy and your personal ideas or whatever. So I just think it's different because it depends on how you grew up and what you're used to. Like I said earlier, there are things you shouldn't put up or things you shouldn't say, but I think privacy is more about choosing what you want to keep to yourself. And so I don't think that Facebook is violating privacy. I think it's letting people choose how they want to define privacy. What she is pointing is one of the most critical factors of how we see these publics change. And this is the notion that things that happen in these network publics are public by default, private through effort. Okay, so when we're interacting in a face-to-face conversation, in an unmediated social situation, our interactions are primarily private by default, public through effort. Okay, so you're having a conversation, it's great, it's all things, maybe somebody overhears it, the likelihood is relatively low, especially since you have a sense of how far it's spread. And if you decide you want to take that conversation and make it public, you have to put a lot of effort into doing so. Right? You have to put an effort into publicizing it. What happens in this kind of networked media where you have a space where you go to or a place that you can actually see what's happening is that the content is, by default, shared. And that you make a conscious decision of what to actually exclude rather than necessarily what to share. And so you see a radical shift in the kinds of content that emerges in these spaces because, for the most part, why do I care? I don't care if somebody sees that. It's no big deal. So it becomes a public by default, private through effort. And in that process of effort, young people are extremely conscious of how to go through the processes to make it private. So many of the teenagers have adopted this sort of public by default mindset, assuming people will go out of their way to make things private. It's also where, this notion of taking photos and putting up all the photos and only untagging people when they get upset. Right? We see these kinds of moves happening all the time because it's sharing is the default, so I actually go through a process of exclusion if I want to remove it. And that is really how that works out. Now, just because interactions are public by default doesn't mean that there's not private information. And young people have varying ideas of what should be private, what is really to be controlled, how that control works, and where they want to go with it. But they're very strongly aware of communication choice, right? And that process by which they're like, well, I'll put that on Facebook because I see no issue with sharing it, versus I really want this to be text messaging because that's the place where I really want to make it one-to-one and I want to signal that, right? And one of the challenges in communication choice is that there's not widespread rules or etiquette, right? It's extremely variable about what goes on, and so there's all of these breaches that happen in this kind of environment. So part of it is to realize that young people also have extremely varied ideas of how to define privacy. And Christina Neppert-Ang, in her latest book, Islands of Privacy, talks about this extensively with regard to adults. And reading along, I'm like, yes, 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 with regard to teenagers. There's a huge amount of variation in what young people think. I'll just give you some sort of sampling of some of the definitions that they've given to me over the time, right? These ideas of respecting yourself, things that when you keep something from the world, a very conscious move to keep it that way, and that ability to keep things private, right? Certain ideas that are kept, and these ideas of when you separate between ideas or when you separate between information, and the idea of space, the opportunities to be alone. All of these come into play in how teens conceptualize it. But again, what matters to them extremely varies. There are plenty of teenagers who are exhibitionists, right, who are actively seeking a massive amount of attention for what they put up online. But even those who are most exhibitionist in their nature have boundaries of what they think is acceptable or not. And what you find is that over and over again, their definitions and their frame of privacy come back to rhetorics of control and agency, right? The ability to have control over a situation and the ability to have agency within that. And Mei-Xing sort of puts this beautifully, right? Because she talks about this, and she in many ways looks like a classic exhibitionist, right? She has an amazing amount of content on her Facebook, things that sort of make all adults kind of go, oh my gosh, right? The way that she puts up everything. And she just says very clearly that she's an extrovert, and she's a very extroverted person. So it's like, so you don't care about privacy? Well, I do care about privacy, but if I found someone that I could trust, my first instinct would be to share stuff with them. For example, I think my last boyfriend and I were really close, so we had each other's passwords on Facebook and to emails and stuff. And I would get something that I didn't know, and then he would notify me and look over my stuff. Now, she takes this to a whole new level. Mind you, password sharing is extremely pervasive, so don't be shocked by that. That's actually much more widespread than you'd realize. But she takes it to a totally different level, because for her, the idea of password sharing is that it makes her feel safer just because someone was out there to help me and stuff. It made me feel more connected and less lonely, because I feel like Facebook is sometimes like a lonely sport. I feel because you're sitting there and you're looking at people by yourself, but if someone else knows your password and stuff, it just feels better. Right? This moment in which she feels as though by sharing everything that's available to her account, she is going through a process of actually bonding in a way that becomes really important and powerful to her. Now, I should note that some of the same dynamics that we see with her, I've seen in extremely abusive relationships. So this is both good and bad depending on how it plays out with particular teens. In her situation, it's a truly connecting and sociable moment, right? Of course, there are a lot of teens who turn the idea of exhibitionism into a game, a way of actually actively engaging in performativity in powerful ways. Interviewing a woman named Chantal, she was talking about her friend Precious, who keeps up various games on Facebook. She'll post things to her status update like, first impression of what I think of you now, like this. Right? And the idea is that when somebody likes what Precious's status, she will then go and immediately comment on their wall what her first impression of them was. Right? And it's a very interesting game that plays into a lot of psychological aspects, right? One, she wants the attention, the ability to get this post liked as many times as possible. This actually triggers a whole set of effects within Facebook that she is very aware of. And in return, she is willing to give something to other people that fulfills their curiosity, both good or bad. And you follow Precious's links to these people and you realize it's both good and bad. Right, so it's not always just like, I love you, you are the bestest, awesomest person ever. Some of it is less than pretty. And so these kinds of games that you see are a way of negotiating that, and ways of negotiating attention and sharing in a sort of constantly moving way. Now, of course, for all of the teenagers who are very exhibitionist, very willing to put themselves out there in very particular ways, there are plenty who are very much kept to themselves, more reserved, more cautious, very much engaged in activities that we would think of as self-monitoring, very conscious of every aspect of their reputation, to a point actually often can be extreme, right? And at a sort of more reasonable level, there's Taylor, who's sort of interesting. She puts up a lot of photos of her. She loves taking photography. She puts up a lot of photography, sort of classic portraiture and classic sort of artistic photos. And she does that, but at the same time, she puts up very little about herself. And part of the reason that she explains is that, I give people the light version. I really don't want them, I don't want them in my business, and I really don't think they have any right to be in my business, right? Well, why do they have a right? Because they're my friends. And she has this notion that even her closest and dearest friends don't have the right that they often try to come in at the level she finds very frustrating. For her, it's because it's always producing drama, right? And this idea of drama that she sees as pervasive in her school, and she wants nothing to do with it. Now, that doesn't mean that Taylor doesn't want some form of attention. And I think it's really interesting to see this quote by her, where she talks about how, I asked her, so, well, would you prefer, private messages instead of comments? And she was like, no. A comment gives me input and it makes me feel good. Even if it's negative, I'd probably like it as a comment. It's just like a message is more personal, which I appreciate. But when people can see they like my work, I like when people can see that other people like it. Because I don't know, it's like getting a lot of comments on one picture and seeing people read them. Right? So at the same time that she sort of wants to have these reserved notions of what is really deeply personal to her, she's willing to put her work out there for feedback because she thinks it reflects very powerfully about her, whether it's good or bad. And she's willing to do that work. Now, the vast majority of teens are actually pretty even keel about what they share and what they're willing to put out there, really constantly engaging in some understanding of self-monitoring, classic impression management work that we've known from Goffman for a long time, really conscious of how they're seen, reacting accordingly to the kinds of impressions and feedback they get. But a fairly high level of disclosure is actually pretty normal. And this is sort of interesting. So for Abigail, she puts out a lot of information, but she says that the people that I go to school with, I know what they're doing, right? But they don't need to know exactly what I'm doing today, right? And she has this idea that she'll talk about generally what she's doing, practice, homework, then alleys, but she doesn't say exactly what she's doing. And she has this idea of sort of when she wants to gloss over. Part of what comes up to this is this idea of when boundary work comes into the conversation, right? Teens often realize that Facebook is broadly accessible, and they have different ideas of how broadly accessible it is, but they're very conscious of it, and they have ideas of what those norms are and what the boundaries are. And for starters, they have ideas of who shouldn't be there, right? And I love the idea that, the idea of who sort of belongs and doesn't belong, right? I think Facebook is for my friends and not my mom. I hear this over and over again, and I love when teenagers go off and about all the things that their moms do on Facebook that they find completely creepy. But you hear these ideas of who belongs and who's allowed to look. And Chantal sort of highlights, this is regard to why teachers might be on her page. I asked her, how she would feel about it because her content was extremely public. And she said, why are they on my page? I wouldn't go to my teacher's page and look at their stuff, so why should they go to mine? And what she's highlighting is that the boundary work is not about a technical boundary, but about what the social norm is. Right? The idea that the social norm should be an operationalized boundary that is different from necessarily what the technology allows. And there's an implicit understanding of how that boundary work happens, and who has the right to look, and who has the right to have access, and what that should be about. When it comes to network publics, teens often distinguish between having access and the right to be there. So they'll highlight that, yes, someone has access, but that doesn't mean they should be there, right? And they see this as sort of a difference. Of course, adults, on the other hand, say, I have the ability to see it, so I should be seeing it, right? Which causes unbelievable amounts of conflict. But these norms come back to these questions of agency, right? What kind of agency do young people have? How can they actually assert control? And when is it about asserting a technical control versus a social control? And they really grapple mostly with dealing with boundaries with regard to people who hold power over them. And that's what they're most concerned about. So part of why they care is that it actually changes the social dynamics entirely. And Carmen is sort of delightful. She talks about how her mom tends to comment on everything. She doesn't mind her mother being around, but she can't stand the constant commenting, right? And she said, then why don't you delete them? It's like, well, I'd feel bad. I don't want to feel bad. She's gotten better, And so, well, why don't you want her commenting? Because it scares everyone away. Everyone kind of disappears after the mom post. It's just uncool, right? And it's this idea that even if her mom's allowed to be there, there's a boundary to what she's allowed to do there. And so teenagers who allow their parents in still have ideas of what's normal and what's acceptable. And it's not just with parents. Parents are always the sort of best case example, but it comes up over and over again. One of the teenagers pointed out that grandma is allowed to do anything because grandma's old. Right, and so there's these ideas of, when are you allowed to sort of step over the boundaries? And, the same teenager who was talking about grandma says, when grandma says things that are funny, everybody laughs. When mom does, no one does. Right? So Hunter actually has a sort of different environment, a different challenge that he faces. Hunter is a young man who lives in a community where he's facing everyday conflicts between the norms at his social school and the norms in the community that he's a part of. Born in Trinidad, his family moved to the his mother brought him and his sister to D.C. to raise them, and it was sort of interesting because he and his sister took very different paths. And as he describes it, he will talk about his sister as ghetto. That's his language for talking about her, and how he really wants to sort of separate himself from her and her friends, and from the school that he's managed to get himself into with a lot of hard work, a sort of charter magnet school-esque environment that he feels really hard work to and spends a lot of time trying to blend in this community that's highly academic and highly rigorous. And Facebook for him presents a constant site of frustration, right? When I'm talking to my friends on Facebook and I put up a status, something I hate is when people I'm not addressing in my statuses comment on my statuses. In my old school, people always used to call me nerdy, and I was at least, the least black person they've ever met, some people would say. And I'd say on Facebook, should I take offense to the fact that somebody put the ringtone white nerdy as for me? And it was a joke. And I guess we were just talking about it in school, and my sister comes out of nowhere and says, "Aw, baby bro." And I'm like, no, don't say that. I wasn't talking to you. Right? And so I said, well, how do people know who's being talked to? And he's like, well, I guess it's a point. Sometimes it's pretty hard, but I think it's just a certain way you talk. I will talk to my sister a different way than I talk to my friends at school, or from friends at old school. I might say, well, I fell asleep in Miss K's class by accident. And they'll say, oh, yeah, Miss K is so boring. And she's like, oh, well, you shouldn't fall asleep. You should pay attention. I mean, I think you can figure out that I'm not talking to you if I'm talking about a certain teacher, right? And he's sitting here trying to figure out how to do boundary work, and he has a ton of different examples of the challenges within his entire community of trying to do that boundary work. Carmen sort of takes it and pinpoints it, right? She's like, everyone I know, they act a certain way around certain people. And this is what Alice and I have spent a lot of time thinking about as context collapse. Right? These moments where you have distinct contexts that you can easily manage in everyday environments that come colliding together in online environments and become one of the most challenging aspects of dealing with it. Right? And young people are acutely aware of it. They don't use such academic language, but they talk about these moments where things collide, where they're sort of struggling with how to deal with different groups and find different strategies for managing them. That's where we get to the sort of fun with strategies. Teens develop a lot of different strategies as ways of managing boundaries. Strategies that show that they understand the architecture, that they're there to reinforce social norms through different kinds of actions that they take, and that they're really bringing their definition into existence in the ways that they're trying to manage the technology, the ways that they're trying to think through it, and how they try to regulate the space for themselves. So Hunter, who we've talked about a second before, he's found this sort of new trick, which is about blocking. So he has gone to an extensive use of the technology to build different groups, to make different content available to different people very systematically. Right, and he gives the example that his cousins think that he's really lame for the fact that he doesn't like shooter games. And so whenever he talks about any game other than a shooter game, they make fun of him. And this causes problems with his school friends because in his school, it's things like Pokemon and Legends of Zelda that are sort of cool and cachet there. So what he does is he's decided that whenever he posts about anything about Legends of Zelda or Pokemon, he very much goes out of his way to block his cousins and to block his sister and block other people that are part of it. Right? Because he doesn't want negative comments about his choices. He doesn't want to have to delete them. He doesn't want to face the embarrassment that he feels about not living up to his cousin's ideas of what's sort of appropriate. Shamika sort of takes an entirely different and sort of more extreme version of things. She actually engages in something that I've talked about as white walling. And it's sort of a fascinating strategy where every day when she logs into Facebook, she goes and she reads the comments that she has received and then deletes them. She goes to and comments on other people's stuff, and then the next time she logs in, she deletes them. And she constantly goes back and forth and keeps her wall white, clean, empty, blank, right? And one of the things I asked her, I said, well, does this material get capped? And she's like, well, of course. I understand that it could get capped. I understand that Facebook could keep it. I said, well, why do you do it? And she said that the amount of effort it takes for people to go back and find the old content when it's been white-walled is much harder than it takes if it was not white-walled, than it is when she white-walls, right? So people have to consciously remember to keep all of her information, and therefore they're actually actively seeking to cause drama with her versus sort of passively because it just happens to be there. And she says that that moment of realizing that someone is truly a stalker, she can write them off. Right? So this moment of using a strategy, using the technology, both of these are examples of using the technology to get there. Carmen sort of goes for a more social approach. She prefers to use language to restrict access to the meaning instead of access to the content. Right? And this is sort of an interesting strategy because she wants to make certain that the material is available, but only those in the know can actually read it. So the example that she gave me is that one day she was feeling sort of sad. She and her boyfriend had just broken up, and she wanted to talk about it to her friends. She wanted to talk about how she was feeling, but she knew that if she posted anything remotely sappy or sad, her mother would think she was suicidal. And she didn't want her mother to think she was suicidal, and she just wanted to sort of let her friends know that she was just not having a good day. So she decided that she would post, and mind you, within her particular community, using song lyrics was a way of expressing emotions. It's extremely popular. This is actually pretty widespread and very widespread in hers. Carmen, mind you, is a bit of a geek. So she decided that she would post song lyrics from Always Look on the Bright Side of Life. Now, for those of you who aren't geeks in the room, you should know that this song is sort of a happy, positive, always look on the bright side of life, and I'm not going to sing it. And it's sung during the point of life of Brian where he is about to be executed, right? Her friends, having recently seen this movie, immediately understood the joke. Her mother, on the other hand, did not. Her mother did not grow up with this content, and for various reasons is not at all familiar with it, which she knew. And her mom immediately wrote a post, oh, it looks like you're doing well, right? Went back to the earlier story, right? Quickest way to keep all the friends away. She was like, sweet, my mother wrote that, and all of her friends texted her, right? It was a moment where she was able to signal to a broad group of people what was going on, but really limiting the access to meaning while not limiting the access to content. Carmen's story is what we can think about as an act of social steganography, right? Steganography, mind you, is an age-old technique of hiding content, hiding information in plain sight. It's often the ultimate security through obscurity, and the Greeks were notorious for using it, which is where it comes from, the idea of wax tablets, tattooing the heads of slaves. Nobody said that this was pleasant. And sort of sending information in ways where people didn't know where to look. And a lot of what you see with teenagers is they put up so much content that people don't even know where to look to access to meaning, to realize that this is something that is actually meaningful unless you're in the moment with the particular group of friends and you understand the context. And that's that power of really sort of limiting the access to content but not to meaning. Of course, limiting access to meaning but not to content. Of course, this doesn't always work as intended, right? And some of the strategies sort of go haywire when something was intended for one thing and gets read an entirely different way and causes problems. In Massachusetts, Kelly was really upset about her relationship. She really just didn't like the boy she was dating anymore, but she didn't know how to break up with him because he was depressed, and she was afraid that her breaking up with him would mess up everything. So she decided that in order to break up with him, she sort of needed to pave the way that she could really make the statement, it's not you, it's me. So she basically posted all sorts of emo lyrics to her Facebook, sort of sappy, depressive things slowly over time. Her friends knew what she was up to and that she was sort of setting the stage, but one of her classmates that she didn't know that well decided to report her to the school as possibly suicidal. And Kelly was like, oh, backfired. Right, so there's moments of who's on the in-group. It's not necessarily about adults, but also the ways in which it gets navigated within peers. Okay, so there's moments where teens will go and sort of hide things through a steganographic approach. They will also go out of their way of hiding content while letting you know constantly that it's being hidden, right? And this is, what Camille talks about is, making fun of people indirectly or fighting. The idea of hiding information, but hiding it so that you still have to be in the know, but you're missing something. And it's that performing of hiding, performing of who's in and who's not. The use of pronouns, the use of reference, right? What happened on Friday night, ha ha ha, right? These moments of knowing exactly what's up. So an example of this is that I'm sitting with Serena in North Carolina. We were going through her Facebook, and I saw this status written by Christy. I'm sick and tired of all of this. Liked by 32 people. So I click on through to sort of continue on through the stream, and next I get, she's such a bitch, liked by 50 people. And I'm like, what is going on? And she's like, oh, the two of them are fighting. And she went into a 10-minute tirade of all of the details of the dramas and the boys and the this and the that and what's all been playing out. Right? And here's this moment where they are engaging very actively in something that we would often call bullying, and always through the use of pronouns. So no one knows that this is the content that's coming up. It's a way of truly hiding what's going on, but letting everybody else who sort of sees it know that there's drama playing out, right? And again, I had a sort of interesting moment in this environment where adults in this particular community had no idea that any of this was happening, right? They all had access to this content, no clue. So you have that sort of moment of how that is dealt with. What Kathy and Christy are sort of performing is a way of actually publicizing their fight to very much draw attention and pull allies into it. And it's a way of creating a certain kind of self-importance and very much about publicity. All right, and of course, you also have these moments of what happens of both wanting to be a part of the dramas, wanting to know what's going on, and there are plenty of teenagers who have no idea what's going on. I will say there's a gender dynamic to this in a pretty hardcore way. Once we get into anything involving drama, all the boys I would just be like, I have no idea, it's girl stuff. And you're like, okay, we'll work with that. And so these ways in which gender dynamics come out in the language of both young men and young women about how they think about it. Even there, we also have a sort of interesting challenge about when people pay attention to things, even though they know it's not for their better interest. And there's ways in which dramas come into being. So Artie is sort of in the situation where, it was involving a breakup, but she didn't defriend the people, her ex and her ex's new girlfriend, because I secretly want to see what they're doing in the future, right? These moments of wanting to lurk, wanting to be a part of the drama. Drama is another paper that Alice and I are working on, so I'm not going to go too far into this. So let me give a sort of conceptualization, sort of package this all together and say, how do we think about this? What I would argue is that what we're talking about is an engagement that we can understand as digital flaneurs, right? Enamored with Parisian society, Baudelaire described a city where people strolled along its streets. He spoke of flaneurs, individuals who came to the streets not to go anywhere in particular, but to see and be seen. Right? The flaneur is neither an exhibitionist nor a voyeur, although both roles come into play at a certain extent. Instead, the flaneur is an intimate part of the city, gaining through participation and being a part of a public in a significant way. And what we see in terms of how young people are engaging with these spaces is that they're very much engaged in an act that looks a lot like a digital flaneur. They're walking the digital streets, they're there to see and be seen, they're participating and they're getting attention and they're enjoying the process, and there are some exhibitionists and there are some voyeurs and there's a wide range of behaviors that go between. But part of the beauty is this ability to participate in a public, to be part of a society is something that really means something to them. And the public that they care about is the public of their friends, right? And what you see is the participation in a public is really a way of doing friendship work. It's a way of negotiating not just the close and intimate ties, but the broader community. It's the process by which people really make sense of their social networks. Not their social network sites, but their social networks. Their relationships to people, their relationships to ideas, their relationships to community, their sense of what the world looks like, and how they sort of navigate beyond that. There is a tremendous amount of learning that takes place in these spaces as they're really trying to make sense of those environments. Of course, it's also how teenagers come to understand their relationship to society, is through participating in various forms of publics, right? Figuring out where things are too risky, what their levels of comfort are, how they understand risk-taking. And part of what you see in terms of risk-taking behavior is that part of it is to understand their relationship within the broader publics, what matters to them, how it matters to them, all of these ways of negotiating it. Through that process, they very much challenge the authority of adults, right? And they challenge the ideas of what the technology are supposed to be about, because their participation is very much about that kind of social work that they're trying to do. They're putting themselves out to be a part of a society, but it's not simply to be public, but to be in a public. But they're also grappling with the very big and very real realities of what visibility looks like. And this is going to be one of their biggest challenges as they come to terms with all of this. Most of what is radically changing because of these networked publics has to do with the degree of visibility. The ability to look in on the lives of a lot of young people who are far removed from your communities, people who you don't know, and these ways in which they can be judged and critiqued and observed, the ways in which you can understand or not understand, the ways that this both empowers a certain kind of tolerance through understanding of difference, and a way in which it really sort of creates a certain kind of hatred because you can see people that are different than you. And this visibility is one of the biggest challenges that I think we see in all of these spaces, because that visibility is something where you can see things, but you don't understand what's happening. And there's a lot of judgmentalness that goes on in that, whether you're a college admissions officer, whether you're somebody in the military and the police force, these ways in which you look out and in which you judge, and where we very much are seeing reinforcement of certain kinds of attitudes and values and beliefs through the ability to see. So at the same time that young people are trying to make sense of a world in which they have a place in a public, they're really having to face the consequences of how visibility is used as a systematic oppression tool. The ways in which it's used to very much keep them in a very specific place, and a place that is very much designed and reinforced through race, through class, through religion. And how does this all play out in all of these different communities? But that visibility is both a blessing and a curse. It is a blessing because they have the opportunity to be seen and find themselves in particular ways, and a curse because it's used to judge them in horrible ways. But this work that they're doing, that work to make sense of visibility, is the work to figure out how the new network publics are going to live and make sense in their lives and their relationship to them. Thank you. Sure. One of the challenges is what work are we talking about? Often when we talk about work, we talk about white collar and white collar labor and what that looks like. And that's going to be very different. Very much the class narratives of labor are going to play out in how this is dealt with. Whether it's about reputation and trust, whether you can actually negotiate it. I think one of the biggest challenges, and for me this is actually where I start to get into the policy work that I think about, is how to actually deal with the reputation management of this stuff as it comes forward into the workforce. So one of the most interesting things in employment law is if you walk into my office looking for a job, I can look at you, I can make I have easy access to things like your gender, a good guess of your race, a good guess of your age, a whole variety of information, right? It's not that you've actively shared that, it's been made available to you. And yet, I am legally required to not discriminate against you accordingly. Of course, does discrimination occur? Yes, all the time, but there's an interesting process in play around that. The challenge is that these environments are this moment of like, oh, well, it's public, so I can use it. And I think we're going to have a really interesting set of rhetorical battles about what it means to think about the ability to access content versus the ability to use it. So that's one part of your question. The other part is, what does it mean in terms of young people as they're navigating things? Part of it is that young people's relationship to labor is really complex and messy, right? There are young people who are very much a part of a creative labor force, very similar to many people in this room, who are very much going to be able to sort of be loud and proud in every way and really sort of astound that, and to use the ability to network with people, the ability to publicize themselves, to actually do well by themselves. This is the advantage that many of us have. There are young people for whom that is not going to be what their life looks like, right? Service labor has never allowed individual flexibility and freedoms, right? So we're going to see a whole set of complex messes around this, and I don't think that it's, I think what we're going to see is just going to be really inflected by those different labor items or elements, and I think it's going to be messed up by, again, how people in power think of young people. We see this over and over again, regardless of technology, right? Those young people, their terrible ways, their long hair, bad, right? We're going to see these things reinforced. The question is are these moments where you can actually leverage these networks for young people to be powerful? And it's really a mixed bag as to whether or not they'll be successful. Shoot.
I was immediately thinking about how familiar some of these interactions seem from my high school days, the less traumatic ones. So I was wondering, what kind of sort of historical data do you have to balance this against?
Right.
To what extent are these tools changing the behavior patterns?
So I obviously don't do historical work, but I work with a lot of people who do historical work, and we have a lot of conversations about what goes on. One of the things is that I find that, and here's where we're going to get to a rhetorical belief. I believe that young people will respond to social conditions in really reasonable ways, and that those structural conditions around what school looks like haven't changed dramatically in the last 50 years, really. So we're seeing a lot of behaviors that are about those structural conditions and those structural environments. Their underlying goals, their underlying values, their underlying attitudes are the same. How it gets inflected by technology is where we see subtle differences, and it's about those sort of moments about visibility, those moments of sort of engaging in things. I don't think that any of this is radically different, and I think that this is where you get another moment. I don't think any of it's radically different except for these moments in which the technology twists it, right? And those twists are where I'm really interested in. But I genuinely believe that young people are completely reasonable in their responses to things, and that they're doing it, and I see the range of things that really fits into the ranges that make sense with regard to those structural conditions, right? So think about it. I've talked to teens who smoke pot during class, right? And because the teachers aren't in school, right? That's not actually new. That happened in my school. And then you see the kids who are, sort of doing this sort of pristine, robot-esque move on their path to get into Harvard. Also not new, right? But the thing is that, and they look very different. They're extremely different kinds of teenagers, but that's because their structural conditions are very, very different. Other questions? Yo, Jesse.
Yeah, so talk a little bit about Alexandra Wallace, the UCLA student who a month ago posted a video making racist fun of her Asian American classmates there, and how that fits into what you're talking about here.
So,
more specifically, my question is, who's the public she imagines?
Right. The thing is that teenagers imagine a public of their friends, and a public of the community that they are a part of. And that comes with all of the baggage of what those communities mean. And I would love to say that she's an exception. I hear it all the time. And I hear it in different forms. The most common form that I hear tends to actually do with homophobia, even more than racism. So boys pranking almost always involves homophobia. So I will deal with teen boys who will have access to their friends' accounts. So the first thing that they do is then use it to write, love notes to other boys in the school in order to embarrass the teen, and these ways of sort of showing off and reinforcing those values. In communities where racism is very much embedded within, racism in all communities. In the communities where expressions of explicit racism are part of status garnering items, elements, you see that very much play out, and you see it very much play out on these sites. And so this is where it's like that language gets to be, it's pervasive, and you see it, and you see these communities where they don't imagine a world outside of it, and it goes in both directions, right? I had a very sort of funny, and it's always not necessarily that extreme. So, I had a very funny conversation. I don't go into the field looking like this, right? I can't get away with it. And so I had this great conversation with a young woman And she's just like, I can't believe my mom, like, she's so weird. Like, she has a Buddha in the house and she just sits down and like prays to it or something. I don't understand what she's doing. And she does like yoga, and that's like for Asian people. And like, why can't she just be normal? Like, my friends are normal, they're Christian, I'm Christian. She doesn't understand, like, she's really embarrassing me, right? And you have this moment where you're just like, oh, okay, right? And so, yes, this is what gets reinforced, right? That's a moment where she's sharing it with me because she sees me very much as a part of her community, and I share it with you in this moment because you will understand that how that doesn't translate even to, you know, sort of 1 degree out of sort of more liberalness, right? So how do we actually deal with it at every level, and how do we have a moment where we can see those reflected back? And I think, I mean, her case blew up, and it was a much bigger public than she ever could have imagined, but these things happen at local levels all the time, and I see them with college admissions officers. Mind you, one thing to keep in mind is that college admissions officers go out of their way when they're recruiting kids for sports, to actually, the coaches recruit, and they use Facebook. And so any school where a kid is being recruited for a sport, they tend to have access to everybody at the school. And this is widely used actually to get access to a whole variety of people through their friends. So it's really interesting that, you know, I'll deal with college admissions officers who are reading this and are making these judgment calls, some of which we would agree are for certain, like, serious, like, oh, well, you know, we don't want to reinforce this racism. Others are sort of more problematic. So I'll give another example. This is back from a couple of years ago. I received a phone call from a college admissions officer, and they wanted to accept a young black man living in South Central in LA. And they had gone to his MySpace profile, and they asked me the question of, like, why would, you know, he'd written a college essay about wanting to escape gangs and sort of the gang-ridden dynamics and all this, and they'd gone to his profile and it's filled with gang insignia. And he's like, well, why would they, you know, he'd lie to us when we can tell the truth online? And I'm sitting here going, I know this community in South Central. He's very much on survival plan, right? He's very much a part of these communities. I don't know if it's brothers or cousins or whatnot. I don't believe he's lying to you. But these moments of how those misreadings or these misinterpretations can read both ways. And it becomes very messy because I think that people don't necessarily understand the context in which they're operating, the context of higher visibility, and how to negotiate those different worlds. All right. Yo.
So, I want to ask about the last intersection of this. Is the flirter example comes up in every single tech conference.
Louder, I can't hear you.
The flirter example comes up in every single tech conference. And the first thing I always think is that those guys have the ultra privilege to be able to take the day off and walk around the city all day. So I want to know how class intersects with this privacy stuff. And I'm thinking about stuff like having, whether or not you own a smartphone and have it at school, you know, whether or not you have your own computer at home, whether or not you have to work after school, stuff like that.
Right. So it's really interesting how much a lot of this has changed over the last couple of years. So there's a couple of different things sort of as gross generalizations that I'll give you. First, we have Pew's data around internet access. And internet access at some level is talking around somewhere between 93 and 94%, depending on the latest study by them. The most challenging is that last 7%, the vast majority of it are environments where kids don't want access. And this is usually for religious purposes, which is also really interesting to keep. We'll keep religion to a separate thing. This is usually homeschooling. So now, for that group, of course, we have huge variabilities in what access means, right? But it's actually sort of messier than you'd think. So first off, we have the ideas of school, right? School are highly filtered systems. And it's really interesting because when you start to go into lower income communities where school is a primary access point, in an urban environment, low income young people will know how to work proxies, no problem. In a rural environment, not true. So that's actually where we have an interesting divide that plays out about rurality versus urbanness, and about the information around proxies and what plays out there. Proxies, of course, give them access to Facebook and MySpace and Twitter and all these sorts of things, and they have all sorts of tricks and ways to do it. I should also notice in low-income schools are less likely to actually know how to use the filters, so they block them a lot less. Mobile phones are sort of an interesting one. Mobile phones actually had a reverse inflection for a very long time, where the Sidekick was such a dominant urban, low-income, and primarily black, but not universally so, device, and it was for serious access points at this level. Low-income urban youth have actually had access to digital technologies that allowed them to access social media for a longer and more sustained period. than wealthier folks. Are they on iPhones? No. But the thing is they're still using these things, and places like Facebook and MySpace are extremely aware of it and very much dedicated to it. Now, of course, these levels of participation really vary. The highest level of participation tends to actually be in the middle class, to the degree that we can talk about that in European or British terms of class, but much more in sort of the middle range, where you don't have restrictions about like you have to do your homework, you can only have 1 hour of internet time a day kinds of things, and where access is still available at home. So you have all of these things that are playing out, but what you'll see is that across the board with young people, if they have any form of access, the first thing they do is something social. So it's like, it's not about homework, it's not about getting information for the test or for school, it's going straight to the social. So the range in terms of what they're doing on the social widely varies. Twitter has been a really interesting tool in terms of how a lot of young people are actually using it in the text messaging style that it was designed for, which I was shocked by in seeing that kind of variation and really using it as a local way. But it's not so clean as like more privilege equals more access. It's not at all like that. It's very messy and murky. And that actually the thing that will be the lowest level of access to social media tends to come to the lowest level of status within the social community. Now, status is often linked to socioeconomic status, but not always. So meaning like these are the socially marginalized and socially ostracized kids by whatever form, right? And that's where it gets very tricky, where it's like it's your self sort of marked geeks, freaks, queers in some ways, but it's also kids who are sort of serious low income in a particular community who are really sort of off the spectrum. Those are the ones who are the least engaged on social media. Yeah.
I get, in my own experience, working in inner city middle school, I've noticed that kids actually usually call a smartphone or a just more advanced technologically phone an adult phone, and then something that you can just text on is like a kid phone or something of that effect. And so you've got this weird age distinction on phones. I want to know what you made of that. And then second, I was also wondering if maybe this is too much of a offline online disparity, but do you think that maybe like the fact that a lot of American students at least, or kids at least, are always in suburban homes where they can't physically go to other places, is that why we see so much social activity online? And like, do we see less social activity where they can walk to a friend's house, or?
It's not about geographic, about walking. This is actually where we get socioeconomic factors extremely at play. So New York City, the rich kids still can't go anywhere, right? But it's so you have this sort of interesting inflection at play about socioeconomic and about mobility, right? Do you allow your kids on the subway? Right? This is a hugely fraught topic of middle upper class kids in ways that it's not in sort of lower socioeconomic brackets. But the explanations that I get for why I can't see my friends in person range. Geographic mobility is one of them. And geographic mobility is a whole set of factors. It's about physically not being able to get there because I can't walk, or I can't bike, or it's too far, or I have to cross the highway, or I have to rely on mom or dad to drive me, and that's not tenable for any number of reasons. Right? So you have these sort of geographic aspects, which play out, have a lot more to do with location than anything else. You have a next segment of things, which is all about ideas of fear. So my mom thinks it's really scary to be outside. I mean, I will go to communities that are like, really? I don't know if there's ever been a crime committed in them. And they'll sit there and tell me all of the ways in which their kids are going to be abducted and harmed and hurt. And I'm like, yeah, says who? And says, we saw this TV special. And you're like, oh no, that's usually where things go badly. So there's all of these different fears. And interestingly, to the best that I can tell, and I would love to see some statistical data on this, it's inversely correlated with actual risks in the community. So the higher level the actual risks are, the more freedom and flexibility and less fear, and vice versa. So in communities where I'm just like, you would let your kids outside, they're like, yeah, no problem. I'm like, okay, perfect. So that is sort of an interesting inflection of it. Next actually has to do with ideas of what free time are. So, and this is seriously socioeconomic driven, which is that I'm going to schedule my kid from morning to night, every single thing is going to do, and they're going to be in structured activities, and you're like, okay, we're on that plan. Great. And those kids, I mean, this one girl sat and walked me through her day, right, about literally every half an hour and what was scheduled for the next couple of weeks. And I was like, well, what do you do because you like doing? And she looked at me and goes, but my mom said I had to do those things. And I was like, okay. So we have these different kinds of structured elements, and that is seriously inflected by upward mobility narratives. And that plays that's another sort of huge component of it. And then the final component of it has to do with meshing of social schedules. So even if I have the ability to do these things, if I'm working after school and my friends have free time, but then they're doing this, and finding that sort of meshing is really challenging. And I guess another factor is there any place they're allowed to be in? I love it. Teenagers will get shooed everywhere, and I love when I get shooed with them. I'm like, really? Thank you, okay. Like, we bought food. So, these moments of how you get shooed because you're some sort of demonized creature. And I don't know if any of you have seen, I have the unfortunate ability of actually hearing the mosquito. And if you haven't seen the mosquito, it's not available in many places in the United States, although it's heavily available in Europe. This is a high-pitched sound that is a little buzzer that is put in places that you want to keep teenagers away from, and the idea is that your hearing changes over time and you will eventually not be able to hear this when you're old, like supposedly us. So the idea is that teenagers only can hear the mosquito. I unfortunately can hear the horrible mosquito, and it's this horrid sound, right? And it's a way of sort of regulating spaces with young people. So there's a whole set of variety there. In terms of middle school versus high school, there's all sorts of amazing narratives about, what my older siblings can do, what is adult. I will one day, adult, mind you, is 16, so it's like, what will I one day be when I'm an adult? There's very much a looking up. This, by the way, isn't new, right? For anybody who's 17 magazine, read by 13-year-olds, right? So there's about a 4-year gap of what you're looking up to and aspiring to. And so that marker is sort of interesting and playing out. Yes?
I was wondering if in your research, if there was anyone at all, any teenagers who purposefully didn't want to be online, whether it's Facebook or some other online component, and were actually popular or considered cool. And the second part of that question is, maybe this is conjectural, but I don't know longitudinally what you've seen. I'm wondering if at some point we're going to find some sort of counter trend where kids who are actually popular and cool, not forced to for religion or some other reason, are going to be sort of segment who are going to just stay offline. So is that going to be impossible?
So what's interesting to me is that in almost all the cases where I have seen a young person not be on it and who is cool, it's the fact that they are cool that allows them to not be on it. So it's like I don't have to be on Facebook because you know what? So-and-so will call me for information on this, and so-and-so will call me for information on this, and all of it will come funneling to me because I'm cool. Right? And it's a way of sort of very much stating, I don't need to be a part of this, I'm above that. And it's just for the plebes in different ways. And so you do see these dynamics, but I don't think that it's tenable. It doesn't actually affect the entire group. It's not something that becomes this. It's just like, oh, well, they're above us in particular ways. And I find those communities are a little strange where I see that. I will note that I have, the communities that I've seen that are serious privileged communities. Serious privileged communities. So I don't tend to see that same sort of rhetoric about status in less privileged communities. And mind you, they're also very wealthy kids, right? So they actually attain status through very traditional forms. And status is not typically acquired through Facebook, but it is often maintained that way. And so it's about these moments in which you are above the process where you need to do the maintenance, right? And that's where you get some really interesting tricks around it all. And unfortunately, we are still in the exact same politics of status that you might remember from if you grew up in the US here, right? It's still all about the same things. How it plays out, what sports mean in a particular school varies. What money means varies, but we're still talking about very traditional means. Yeah.
That is two short questions. The first is
Loud.
The first maybe about the backside of the study. You mentioned how you dress up when you go to speak with your team. I would actually be intrigued to hear more about the way you manage your presentation itself when you go and speak to the team. And the second one, you talked quite a bit about the connection to parenting and how helicopter parenting fits into all this. And I would also love to hear a bit more about how do you see what kids are doing online as connected to the concept of parenting for their parents.
Sure. So first, in terms of my performance, I go out of my way to look relatively boring. So I grew my hair out. For anybody who remembers me from years ago, I used to have all sorts of ridiculous, crazy hair. I'm back to something sort of weird because I was really, really bored. But I really grew my hair out. It became very simple, very sort of generic, natural colors, which for me was a really shock. The earrings go. I get back into a jeans and t-shirt. It depends on the community and what sort of, I understand the sort of normal version of it. I don't try to look like a teenager. I very much try to just look like a simple adult who doesn't fit into a classification of anybody specifically in their world. So I don't dress like a teacher and I don't dress like their parents, but I very much just try to dress like, you know, somebody who might be their aunt, right? Somebody who's sort of just generically there. And, you know, my conversational strategies with young people are very much just like, I'm trying to hear from you. I'm trying to hear their lives and how it plays out. And now I've blanked on the second half of your question, which was, trigger?
About parenting.
Oh, parenting. So I actually do a lot of talking to other people when I'm out in the field, including parents, but it's all to understand the dynamics from young people's perspective. So I don't directly interview parents, although I'll sit and talk to them for hours. It's more trying to actually understand context about young people. Likewise, I spend a lot of time in the communities that I visit hanging out and talking to adults of all forms that have relationships to young people. So I spend a lot of time with youth ministers, with law enforcement, with after-school program folks, with teachers. I spend an obscene amount of time at IHOP and Mickey D's. I go to church every weekend. Most of this country is actually Christian. I tend to go to whatever the popular church is within the community that I'm visiting. I do a lot of work to understand the community, but it's all in order to understand the teenager, right? It's all to understand their perspective. And so I can't feel like I can really speak on all of the cultural logic of parents as much as I can speak to how teenagers perceive those dynamics. And you know, it's part of the sort of fun. I've learned more about football this fall than I thought was possible. I didn't know that much about football, so that was sort of fun. And so, you know, sit there and see these dynamics, and I watch those dynamics. But I don't think that I can speak to parenting, and I don't think I want to be honest with you. Both because it's like, this is how I get into trouble with my friends. I've decided that it's giving advice on parenting in any form based on what I see is a really bad idea for my friendships. So I kind of have decided that emotionally I want to stay out of it. It's just a little safer for me. Yeah.
So for me, the broadness of all the information that we all have access to has a lot of potential for a very highly intelligent youth. So I was wondering if in your research you've come across any kids that spend a lot of their time on iTunes listening to lectures like at Yale or something. Like, are there kids like taking advantage of what's at their fingertips?
Again, the kids who, of all ages, who are really taking advantage of these things are the ones you would predict are, right? They're already upwardly mobile, determined to get into these schools. They've been hearing about MIT since they were 3. They're on that storyline, and you don't tend to see it outside of that. And so it really does fit more traditional frames. So the work that I did with Mimi Ito, with a whole gang of people, we wrote a book, Hanging Out, Messing Around, and Geeking Out, and a lot of people interpreted it to assume that there was a trajectory, right? You would hang out, and that would make you mess around, and then that would make you geek out. No, it doesn't actually work like that, right? In fact, most of the kids who are geeking out, they may have done these other things, but it wasn't actually a trajectory, and it's not a path, unfortunately. There are amazingly exceptional kids, and there are amazingly exceptional kids in unexpected ways. And those, I will say, are the ones, you know, when I talk to teenagers who are the parents of, the kids of seriously privileged people, I'm just like, all right, of course you're doing these things. I get really excited by the exceptions in the middle of things. You know, the Hunter, who I sort of pulled from at different points about his sort of challenge, he's reading all sorts of books, and I'm just like, where did you get your hands on that, right? Like, that's so exciting. And he's just sort of doing it on his own. And you find that sort of highly motivated kid every once in a while, but the vast majority of it isn't. There's one group of teenager that I think is sort of really fascinating. So I grew up amongst the hacker cohort of my years, which was all about phreaking, and it was all about breaking into security systems just to prove that you could. There's another generation of that, and it's really delightful to talk to them, and this is the 4chan group. These are the kids who are all interested in figuring out ways to hack the attention economy. And that's how they're like, how can they mess with systems? Those teenagers are engaged in amazing amounts of online learning, right? Amazing. Most teenagers, though, have really bought the don't talk to strangers rhetoric, hook, line, and sinker, and aren't interacting with anybody, not learning from anybody that they don't already know. It's all pre-existing social groups, except for the sort of 4chan kids. And one of the places I'm so desperately wanting data on this, we've been talking about, my LGBT youth that I interview at this point will not talk to strangers online. Strangers are a dangerous, dangerous group. They're out to harm them and hurt them. And I'm seeing seriously depressed and suicidal young people. And I'm just like, my group, we grew up online interacting and it was great. This is gone. The stranger danger rhetoric is everywhere. So it's not just about accessing information that's existing silos, but accessing communities where you might learn that information. And the stranger danger rhetoric has done more damage than I ever could have imagined in 5 years. Yeah.
So I don't know if you have an answer to this, but you're talking, you've learned all of these things about teenagers and their use of the internet. Is there any way that we can actually, do you have any ideas of how to leverage this information to, teach kids about cyberbullying in a way that doesn't sound like it's coming from their parents, or talk about LGBT issues or those kinds of things?
So, one of the sort of best things that I try to do is I try to make my stuff as public as possible, and I try to work with a lot of different groups. I am actively working with a whole set of both education folks and with public policy people about these issues. Bullying is one of the most tricky issues out there, and the reason why is that we actually don't know how to do interventions that work for bullying, period. I don't care about digital. We don't know how to do bullying interventions. What we desperately need are a lot more public health type scholars who will buy into these issues. And the reason why I say public health is that what you need is evaluation-based interventions. Do I have ideas? Sure, I have ideas. But I don't want people to try out my ideas. I want them to try out things that are about really doing interventions with evaluation, and let's figure it out. So right now what I'm doing is, rather than sort of espousing ideas, I'm actually working to try to harness funding to do intervention-based work, not for me, because I'm not that kind of scholar, but to figure out who those scholars are to do the kind of public health work that we need. And I feel like for a lot of the intervention-based stuff, my strength is as a describer and explainer of sort of basic things, and I can only go so far. I spend a lot of time trying to then get statistical numbers to figure out when that is the right approach for things. And when it comes to interventions, I'll go and provide as much descriptive material as possible, but I strongly believe in evaluation-based interventions and done in a very systematic way where you really understand the variables. Unfortunately, with bullying, we have so many do-gooder organizations out there who really want to help the universe, but are not willing to actually take the step to say, look, let's actually treat this systematically. And so I've started to see the materials that go out, and I love when I see these sort of, clearly you were designed for a very privileged school with very specific stereotypes about how kids interact, and now we're going to put this into an urban school with a very different dynamics, and it's just funny. Right? Like it's laughable. It doesn't work at all. So you really also have to think about what those variables are and how they play out, and really think about harnessing it within those communities. And there's a lot of work to be done, but in some ways I can only go so far. It's about the next group.
You actually have to...
I am in trouble. I'm told to be quiet.
No.